The Nintendo 3DS launched in late 2010 in Japan and in 2011 in the rest of the world, and I have to say, it is one of the most influential pieces of hardware of my entire life. I've spent so much time playing various 3DS games, and that even bled to my YouTube channel, where tons of my videos were recorded off of a 3DS capture card, and wouldn't be possible without the 3DS system. It's technically a 2DS, I guess, that costs an extra $200 or so, thanks to this big bulge in the back that helps me record gameplay from it, but this piece of hardware helped me make so many videos and streams, even to this very day, which I am very thankful for. I remember when the 3DS first came out as well. I was only 15 years old at the time, and I really wanted it, but at the time of the release, it had a pretty ridiculous price tag of about $300, which I could not afford at all at the time. I remember spending about $50 or so on one of those arcade games where you could win expensive prizes in early 2011, and one of the prizes happened to be a 3DS. Sadly, I did not win, ended up wasting a lot of my money at the time, but a few months later in the summer of 2011, I finally got my own 3DS system. The early part of the 3DS lifespan is something that I think a lot of people forget about, despite the 3DS being one of Nintendo's biggest success stories and having some amazing games. The launch of the 3DS wasn't exactly smooth. The only notable games of the 3DS's release year outside of Ocarina of Time 3D, which was just a port of an N64 game, were Mario Kart 7 and Super Mario 3D Land, both coming out for the 3DS in late 2011. Now these games are pretty good, but the system still wasn't doing that great at this time. People actually thought the system would flop, but luckily Nintendo decided to drop the price of the system and release games that would sell the system, as well as a revised version of a 3DS in 2012 with a bigger screen dubbed the 3DS XL, which was the first of many redesigns for the 3DS system. One of the most notable hardware revisions of the 3DS in my opinion is the 2DS, which is essentially the same thing as a regular 3DS, except does not have a clamshell design and doesn't have any 3D capabilities whatsoever. This admittedly is a rather strange omission, as the main gimmick of the 3DS console was the whole 3D slider and being able to play games in 3D, so seeing a system in the 3DS family that didn't have 3D was rather peculiar. It seemed like most games just straight up ignored or barely took advantage of the 3D aspect as well, especially after 2011, as although it was a neat feature, after you see it once, there really isn't much of a need to ever use the 3D feature again. I'm sure Nintendo had bigger plans for this 3D feature, and they are pretty cool, especially for its time upon release, but the 3DS is remembered for so much more than just being a 3D handheld, which I think is good for its legacy. Now 3D wasn't the only gimmick to the 3DS. This is something that I think a lot of people forget about when it comes to the 3DS, but the 3DS did have some sort of VR components to it thanks to the 3D cameras on the system. If you got a 3DS early back in 2011, at least I got these when I first got my 3DS, I don't know if newer 3DSs come with this, there was these little VR cards you could use to scan with your 3DS, and like a little 3D image of Mario would show up on your screen, and there's a few other minigames you could play. Again, I don't think many people really talk about this. This is something that really wasn't that explored with the 3DS system, especially after its release, as I've seen no games really take advantage of this, but it's yet another cool little feature the 3DS has that just adds to its charm in my opinion. In the end, the 3DS came out on top in the mobile gaming market. It completely murdered the Vita in terms of sales and popularity, and the 3DS's only real competition was the growing mobile phone gaming industry, which really started to pick up in 2011 thanks to games like Angry Birds. Without the 3DS, I probably wouldn't still be making videos on this channel, and even if I still had my channel for whatever reason, it would be far different than it is today, as like I said earlier, a majority of my most popular videos were recorded off the 3DS capture card or made possible because of games I've played on the system. The sad reality is now that the Switch came out and it's more of a hybrid home console and portable console at the same time, the 3DS just is on its way out. It's been out for 8 years now, and 8 years is a pretty long time for a console's lifespan, especially when it's a mobile console. Compare that to the original DS, which only had a lifespan of about 6.5 to 7 years, and the Game Boy Advance before it, which only lasted about 5 years, and it really puts things into perspective. For some reason though, more so than other consoles I've seen, it seems like fans just do not want to accept the fact that the 3DS is on its way out and that the 3DS is dying. I still get comments pretty frequently or messages in my stream chat asking about what the next Pokemon game will be like for the 3DS, and that people are upset that Pokemon Let's Go wasn't on the 3DS as well, which I think just shows how loved the console is. When it comes to Pokemon, which is a huge selling point for the 3DS, especially when X and Y came out in 2013, we already know that there will not be another main series Pokemon game coming to the 3DS at all. They confirmed that Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon would be the last main series Pokemon games for the system when they came out, and if you played those games in the original 3DS, you can probably understand why that is. The games just run so slowly, and you can tell the 3DS was really pushed to its limits with the later releases of Pokemon games. I guess it is possible we could potentially see some sort of side series Pokemon game come to 3DS later this year, or possibly even if 2020, if the 3DS is even still getting games at that point. Sort of like what we saw with Pokemon Conquest coming out very late in the original DS's lifespan, over a year after the 3DS came out in 2012. When it comes to main series Pokemon games on the 3DS, I think there is absolutely no chance we'll ever get one, especially since they literally said Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon would be the last main series games on the console. Now when it comes to 3DS games in general in 2019, however, there really isn't that much. The overall quantity of the games coming out this year is rather low than previous years, but the quality is still there, and there are some notable releases for the 3DS in 2019. We had Yokai Watch 3 released in North America earlier this year. Despite it being out in Japan for 3 years now, it was still nice to see it come out in the West. Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn in March coming out for the 3DS as well, which is a port of the Wii version strangely enough, but I'm sure that some people will be excited for that game as Kirby has a pretty big following. Persona Q2, which released in Japan in late 2018, will be coming out in the US in June of this year as well, which again, Persona, one of the more popular series, even coming to Smash Bros, so I'm sure there's a lot of people excited for that game. And the last game from 2019 I want to talk about is the new Luigi's Mansion game, which will probably be the most popular and most anticipated 3DS game of the year, and most likely the last very big release for the console. Although in my opinion this game should have came out like 3 to 4 years ago, but that's another point. We also have a rather interesting game I almost forgot to talk about that came out this year, and that was Mario & Luigi Bowser's Inside Story plus Bowser's Jr. Journey, which is a mouthful. Now this is largely just a remake of the older DS game, but the Mario & Luigi games are still pretty popular, and they are Mario games after all. Now this Mario & Luigi series has been around since the Game Boy Advance with Superstar Saga, and they are very fun games. They're basically Mario RPGs, kind of like Paper Mario in a way, but they still have that same charm as a regular Mario platformer, which I love. When it comes to Bowser's Story plus Bowser Jr., however, the game sold abysmally for the 3DS despite having Mario on the cover and being a relatively popular series, which further shows that the 3DS is on its verge of being completely dead. I honestly think 2019 is the last year the 3DS will get any relevant games, as most of the games coming out this year for the console are just remakes, ports, or even indie titles. Like I said, there are some good games here, but the overall quantity is a lot less than in the past. Maybe we'll see similar games to Just Dance released for the 3DS or something like that, as dance games are surprisingly still keeping the Nintendo Wii alive even to this day, as they're the only games that have come out for the Wii since 2015. It's actually kind of funny to see this, as the Wii gets at least one new game every year since 2015, even though the console came out in 2006. Retailers are even starting to get rid of the 3DS inventory they have in stock, with places like Target having sales on 3DS consoles and 3DS games, and rumors floating around that a lot of other big retailers have slowed down or completely stopped stocking 3DS consoles and are slowing down on stocking 3DS games. The interesting thing about all of this is Nintendo released another redesign of the 3DS rather late in the 3DS's lifecycle in 2018 with the new 2DS XL, which they always seem to do a year or so before the console officially dies, so I guess it's not that peculiar. We had the Game Boy Micro at the very end of the original Game Boy Advance's lifecycle, the DSi at the very end of the original DS's lifecycle, and now a redesign of the 3DS in 2018, which will likely be the last variation of the 3DS we have seen. And Nintendo has dished out more than its fair share of redesigns for their 3DS system. Nintendo typically likes to release a couple of redesigns for their mobile consoles, as we've seen in the past with the Game Boy Advance SP, and also with the DSi and the DS Lite, but the 3DS was a special breed and had a lot of redesigns. You had the original 3DS released in 2011, you had the 3DS XL a year later in 2012, you had the 2DS, which was the flat system without any 3D capability, you had the 2DS XL, the new 2DS, the new 2DS XL, and after the new 2DS it got a little bit confusing. I feel like once they released any console with new in the title, they kind of shot themselves in the foot a little bit, in the sense of you can't release another iteration of your console after you already put new in the title, because the new in the title already confused people a little bit, but it did drive people to get the new console as it did have new in the title. Although it is the same console, it did play a few unique games that the older console could have, so at least it did have some variation and some sort of unique value to it versus the older systems. Personally, I think that the 3DS is just fine the way it is. I still have my original 3DS from 2011 and never bought any other redesign outside of the 2DS, which I needed for capture card purposes, but I still think that all the consoles are great. But to be honest, I really never saw the point of getting one redesign over the other, as they all pretty much do the exact same thing. Nintendo has released so many different variations of the 3DS since 2011, and I'll be surprised if we somehow get another, especially considering the rumors going around of the redesign for the Switch coming soon, which makes sense since the Switch is already 2 years old, which is hard to believe. I feel like just yesterday, I was waiting for that console to come out, and it was referred to as the NX for the longest time. Now, I do think it is really sad to see the 3DS go, as there are tons of games I loved on this console, like the various Pokemon games, Animal Crossing, and so much more. 3DS in general is largely responsible for popularizing Fire Emblem outside of Japan as well, as for the 3DS Fire Emblem games, they weren't really that popular over here and didn't have that much of a following, but now they're arguably one of Nintendo's biggest franchises. The console did have an amazing legacy and will go down as one of Nintendo's greatest consoles, arguably over the GBA, but I do still think that the original DS system has a slight edge over the 3DS, but that doesn't take away from the charm or how amazing the 3DS console actually is.